Identity and access management. First, you have to authenticate people, which is you identify yourself by just claiming to be somebody. You authenticate yourself by proving it with something like a password. That's something you know. That's the most common and weakest method. Something you have, like a card you carry, or something you are, like biometrics. Another possibility is where you are, location sensing. These are all things that will help authenticate who you are. So your passwords, the most common is static ones. You can also have passphrases that are just long like a sentence. Passwords that can only be used once, and dynamic ones that change. The static passwords are a typical kind where users make them up, and they're very famously weak. You can get them by phishing. You can often get them by just guessing from a list of common passwords and so on. So it's better if you go to two-factor authentication with a second factor, like a smart card or biometric. Passphrases are long passwords composed of words with punctuation, sentences, and everything, which is much stronger than passwords. One-time passwords can only be used once. The most common use of these is reset logins, but you can have them. And then, of course, dynamic passwords like these RSA tokens, where it creates a new PIN every 30 seconds or so. And they look random, but they're not random. They're generated in a predictable pattern with some kind of seed, and the server knows the seed, so they can predict what the next number should be, so they can tell if you really appear to own this token. The problem here is the tokens are kind of expensive. Often you use a phone app instead. And then there's strong authentication, which is multi-factor authentication, where you have more than one factor. Just having two things you know and two things you are is not multi-factor. You have to have two separate things, because if it was, say, two passwords that you know, then if someone could steal one, they could probably steal them both. The idea is to have things that are different enough that it's very difficult for a crook to steal both of them, like a password and then one of those RSA tokens, so they can steal your password with some attack online like a phishing attack, but to steal your physical hardware token, they would have to perform a physical theft in the real world, and that's a significant amount of different kind of work, so much more difficult. So you might guess the password, the password might be logged somewhere, and typically you use clipping levels and account lockout to prevent people from guessing too many passwords. After they have some number of failed logins, like 5 in half an hour or something, then you lock their account out for a period of time, like an hour, or perhaps until they actually go physically to a help desk with an ID card, however you want to design your system. But you don't let people just guess many passwords, because that would let the bad guys in. Passwords are not stored in plain text generally, although there are systems that do this. Then it's considered a ridiculous failure. You make a hash of the password. So you can identify when the correct password comes in, but if somebody steals the stored file, they don't have the passwords. That's the idea. They have to crack the hashes, and the only known way to do that is to start with a huge list of passwords, calculate all the hashes, and try to match the hashes. So the password hashes are stored in etc shadow on Unix systems. In Windows, they're stored in the Security Accounts Manager, part of the registry. And local account hashes are stored on the local drive, and domain account hashes are stored on the domain controller. They're also cached on the local system after a domain login. So you can get password hashes fairly easy from a Windows system, and then you have to crack them. You can also get them from network traffic. There's a different hashing system used for network traffic on Windows. Or you can read it from RAM. The SAM file is locked while the operating system is running, but there are known hacking tools that will get it. And so landman hash, these days, if you look at a password, here's a password calculated, and here's a password with a capital P. And notice that the landman hash, which LM, E52C, it doesn't change, because the old system used by versions of Windows before Windows XP actually turned all letters to uppercase to make them even simpler, and then the password hashing would take place 7 characters at a time. So it was really extremely weak, and it was pretty easy to make a system that would try all possible passwords. So they were ridiculous, and Microsoft quit using that system. They upgraded to the NT system, which is much better than Landman, being only 1,000,000 times weaker than what Linux uses. So a dictionary attack is the most common technique, where you have a list of possible passwords, usually dumped from previous hacks, and then you just try all those passwords. One countermeasure is password complexity, to try to make users choose passwords that aren't in the dictionary. That pretty much fails these days, because the dictionary includes real passwords other people chose that were obeying these common complexity rules, so it's not as useful as you might think it would be. So brute force is in principle trying all possible combination of characters. In practice, people seem to call a dictionary attack a brute force attack these days. Anyway, it's quite slow, but if you're trying to crack stolen password hashes, then you can try millions of guesses per second. You don't really have to try logging into some system, which would be slower, and you'd probably hit some kind of lockout. Rainbow tables is a technique to use a bunch of memory to make a lookup table, so the calculation of password hashes is faster, so you use more memory to save time. And there are hybrid attacks is a common one, where you start with a dictionary of passwords, and then you modify the dictionary, like combining two words together, changing uppercase and lowercase, changing some letters to numbers, and so on. So you modify the words in a dictionary to get more password types to guess. Now, salt makes password hashes much stronger. If two users choose the same password and you don't have a salt, they will end up with exactly the same password hash, and you can detect that by detecting a duplicate in the password hash file. To prevent that, you add a random series of letters to the password, like perhaps 8 letters, and then you hash that, and you store the salt in plain text with the hash. So now two users that choose the same password will have completely different salts, completely different hashed passwords. All right, and this makes rainbow tables much less useful, because you'd have to prepare a rainbow table for each value of the salt, and that would make it essentially impossible. Here's the Windows 10 password settings. You can set a password history, so you can't use any of your previous 24 passwords. You'll have to reset your password every 90 days. This is what most people do, although it's no longer recommended. You have minimum password length 8 characters, must meet complexity requirements. Like I said, that stores it, records you have uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and numbers, at least 3 of those things. And reversible encryption is a terribly bad idea and disabled by default. That stores a version of your password that can be easily decrypted, so it's almost the same as storing it in plain text. And it's only there for backward compatibility with, I think, MS-DOS. So it's unlikely that you need that. Anyway, users often write down their password somewhere unsafe, like sticky notes. That's a problem. So something you have, a synchronous dynamic token like the RSA token we saw, will have some series of numbers that the server can recognize. An asynchronous dynamic token is not synchronized. It has, say, a challenge response. So it'll say, type in this number, and then it'll calculate some other number from that. I haven't used these, but it's another way to do it. And so you enter your username, the system sends you a challenge, you enter the PIN and the challenge, the token generates the response, which is sent to the server. It's another way to do it. It's just a way to prove that you have this physical device, this smart card. Then something you are. Register with a biometric system like fingerprints or face recognition. And so the goal is it should not take more than 2 minutes to enroll a new person in the system, or it's going to be so clumsy as to be too irritating to use. And to authenticate a user should only take a few seconds. If it's taking longer for either of these steps, then it's going to be so inconvenient people usually won't accept it. But you can choose what you like. So if you put the false accept rate and the false reject rate as a function of sensitivity, you can turn the sensitivity of your biometric control way up, and then it will have a very slow false accept rate. Nobody's going to get in with the wrong fingerprint, but a lot of people with the right fingerprint are going to be falsely rejected because you made it very, very picky. Conversely, if you make the sensitivity very low, then you'll have a very low false reject rate. The real user's fingerprint will generally be accepted, but there's a high chance that someone with the wrong fingerprint will be accepted. So you can adjust this depending on your security needs. This way is more availability. This way is more confidentiality. And to rate the quality of the sensor, you can get the crossover error rate where these two are identical. And if you have a good sensor, the crossover error rate will be low. If you have a sloppy sensor, the crossover error rate will be high. All right. So fingerprints are the most common, and they usually make a mathematical representation of some of the features they find on the fingerprint, like these here, these features, by places where 3 lines intersect, places where you hit a peak, and so on. You store some of those things, and then you have some threshold of how many of them have to match. Then there's retina scan. This is considered very accurate, but people don't like it because you have to stick your eye in a cup, and it seems like a little bit invasive. It isn't actually touching your eye, but people just don't like having some weird cup getting close to their eye. Then there's iris scan, which is much more passive. This is looking at the part of your eye you can see, the colored part, which has some pattern of sort of lines and dots, which is sort of like a fingerprint and easy to see. In fact, you can even see it with a high-resolution camera from quite a distance away. So this is more popular. It's still, from what I understand, they're expensive, though. And then there's hand geometry. I've seen these. You put your hand in a little tray a few inches above an infrared reader that measures the geometry of your hands, like the veins in your hand or something like that. I guess it's actually the fingers. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, it's not a fingerprint, but it's more or less a fingerprint. Something about your hand to identify it. And there's some people talked about keyboard dynamic, where they make you type something, and they can just tell from the way you type, the rhythm of your fingers. Someone says Vision Pro uses an iris scanner. That's interesting. Is that a type of phone or something? Anyway, an iris scanner does seem like the sweet spot if it can be brought down to a reasonable cost. Anyway, dynamic signature is another thing where you write something with a pen, and the pattern of pressure you use and such would be distinctive like a signature, I guess. And your voice print is the famous one from science fiction all through my life, saying my voice is my password. This turned out to be enormously more difficult than anybody thought it would be. Not only is it obviously vulnerable to a replay attack, I could just record your voice. It turns out that people's voice changes a lot. You get a cold or something, and so it turns out to be quite difficult to make this actually work for authentication, and I haven't seen it used much. Oh, the $3,500 Apple headset, that uses an iris scanner. Okay, yeah, it could. It's expensive enough, I guess. And then, of course, facial scan. This is what my iPhone uses. It scans your face, I think, with an invisible infrared laser, so it's actually getting a 3D model of your face. It seems very good. The one I use on my iPhone seems to recognize me fine. Anyway, there's also facial recognition quite around a lot. At one of the Super Bowls in 2001, they actually used facial recognition to try to pick terrorists out of the crowd. Facial recognition has a spotty history, as I mentioned many times in the news. It seems to fail very much for black people. So a whole lot of innocent black people keep getting fingered by facial recognition, and that problem has made it very difficult for police departments to deploy it or get away with it. It just seems to be too unreliable, at least for black people. And then someplace you are. You want to find out where you are. You can do it from GPS on your phone or from your IP address, and then we can decide if you're in a certain area where you're not allowed to watch a football game or something, or if you're trying to make a purchase and you do not geolocate as at the physical location of that store, then that suggests that you're an attacker attacking over the network, that sort of thing. All right, let's try a Kahoot, which is here, 5A. Does anybody have the Vision Pro? I've heard it's good, but it's far too expensive. I kind of imagine that nobody that rich would be taking my classes. Yeah, Tim Apple, yeah. Yeah, that's what Trump called Tim Cook. Boy, I sure hope we don't have another 4 years with Trump. Anyway, I guess we'll know pretty soon. All right, so what biometric system denies entry to authorized users? That's if it has a high false reject rate. That's rejecting people that shouldn't be rejected. All right? All right, what file contains the password hashes on Windows? Yeah, you folks know the Security Accounts Manager. Very good. All right, so what do you add to a password to make it two-factor authentication? Something that is not something you know. And all these PIN, SSN, and hometown are all something you know. The face recognition is something you are. So that would make two-factor authentication. Something you know, the password, and something you are, your face. So it would be difficult for an attacker to steal both of those things at once. All right, what stops online brute force attacks? Yep, locking you out after a certain number of guesses. That's your strongest defense. All right, and what's the weakest type of password hash? LM is the Microsoft one that's so weak even Microsoft won't use it anymore. All the rest are much stronger. Linux $6 is what was used. They moved to something even more secure in the last 2 years, but this is the one that's 1,000,000 times stronger than Microsoft's NT one, and that's much stronger than LM. Anyway, all right. And SHA-1 is stronger than the old LM system too. Root. Good. Oh, let's do some more of these. So, all right, so the technologies to manage this access control, you typically want to have centralized access control for any organization. You want to have one logical place where you can add new accounts and cancel accounts and such. And then you can have single sign-on, where you have one sign-on and that allows access to many systems. So this is often called a AAA server, authentication, authorization, and accountability. So it authenticates users, decides what they're allowed to do, and maintains logs of what they've done, so you can check later and decide if somebody is doing a bad thing. All right. Decentralized access control is where you have local sites with independent local information, and this is usually not a very good idea because they might vary in how they administer policies, and attackers might find the weakest link. So this is something people do at very small businesses that aren't well organized, but it's Microsoft's recommendation is by the time you have 10 computers, you should really have a domain controller for centralized administration. You really can't possibly manage more than 10 computers without a central point of control. So single sign-on is where you sign in once, and this gives you access to a variety of services rather than making you sign on again and again to each service, so it's more convenient. Of course, it's more convenient for attackers. If they find some way to defeat it, then they can get into many systems. So it is, like many things in security, it's more convenience at the cost of more risk. So you have, typically you should combine it with two-factor authentication. That would make it much stronger. An attacker, however, might hijack an authenticated session, and then somebody else logs in and the attacker does something like steal the single sign-on token off the wire. Now they can get in that session without having either of the two factors. So that's an issue. And users should, of course, be trained to lock their workstations when they leave their desks so people can't walk over and use somebody else's machine. So you have your access provisioning lifecycle, which is how you're going to handle adding people to the system and removing them from the system when they should no longer have access. So you check your password policy, see if people are complying with it, notify people when they're about to expire, identify lifecycle changes like accounts that are inactive for 30 days might be turned off or unused for 10 days. revoke access rights when contracts expire. This is an extremely common problem, that people are fired or otherwise leave, but they leave their access active on the system, so somebody that has left logs in and does harm later. That's quite common. So you should coordinate these things. When somebody is terminated or moved from one location to another, you should promptly fix their access. This used to be my job at my financial company. When they were going to fire somebody, they would call them to have a meeting with the boss in the back room. So they'd walk across this big floor, and while they were walking, they would call me and say, delete their account. So that before they even knew they were fired, their account was deleted. And that is, of course, the right way to do it. Then they couldn't possibly log in and do harm after they find out they're fired. So access aggregation is when you get, as you move through a company and get promoted in different systems, you get more and more access, and they forget to remove the old access. This happens at the college. They never take keys back. As you teach in different rooms, they give you more and more keys, so the old teachers just have a whole drawer full of all the keys you can get. Authorization creep is more of it, where you get more and more entitlements. This can defeat least privilege and separation of duties. It's a poor way to organize things, of course. You should give people only the access authorizations that they need to do their current job. Anyway, federated identity management lets you share logins from one company with another company. This is what Microsoft did. I was just telling someone this story earlier today. When Microsoft made a deal with the Texas company that Ross Perot runs to print their paychecks, they would had the W-2 information there, so Microsoft put a federated identity management server inside that other company, whose name I forget, so you could use your Microsoft login to log into the check printers systems to get your W-2. And that was fine, except then Microsoft laid off some people, and now those people could not log into ADP, that's the company, American Data Processor. They couldn't log into there to get their W-2. So anyway, that's federated identity management. And in practice, almost everybody lets you log in with Facebook for almost every normal consumer website. So they're basically the world's identity authority, wherever you go. And as mentioned, Obama wanted to make a government ID you use everywhere so you wouldn't have to remember all his passwords, but people were horrified by this, and he did not do it. Pro Systems. Pro Systems are ADP, data processing. They print the paychecks for almost every company. I guess they must be a good deal. Almost every company finds sending them your data and paying them to print your paychecks is better, because they handle all the tax issues and such. ADP. Yeah, Ross Perot ran for president. That was his company that made him rich, was this data processing company that seems to print all of America's paychecks, as far as I can tell. SAML is a system to move information about security over a network. You have XML blogs of data which have an assertion, such as, I have logged in, my name is Sam, this is my username, this is my address, that sort of thing, or I have logged in as the administrator. And it sends a cryptographic signature verifying this, and that's what goes over the internet. So this lets you do single sign-on. Canvas uses SAML, I think. So identity as a service is where you have a cloud identity, a cloud provider provides storing passwords and whatever else you're using, like two-factor, and identifies people, and then has a way for you to use them as your login service. So it integrates with cloud applications. It's an easy way to get two-factor authentication. There are famous services that do this. I think Duo is one, Duo. You can switch to them, and they will handle the two-factor for you, and then you just use that cloud service for authentication. So, all right. Microsoft offered one of these called Microsoft Accounts or Live ID. There are many of them out there. And then there's password managers, which everybody should be using. All of you students should get used to them. If you aren't using one, you should get one. The current hotness that I hear recommended the most is Bitwarden. I used LastPass, which got hacked and got sold to a company that made them sleaze their product inferior. It's no longer recommended. Bitwarden seems to be the most popular one, open source, free, and anyway, but you should use some password manager. There are a bunch of them. They can generate passwords, store them, and therefore you just have to remember one master password to get in the system, and it has all your other passwords in there. All right. And if you have a third-party identity service, you can run a local copy. I know you can run your own Bitwarden server if you want to, instead of using some other cloud service. That you might do if you're very, very unwilling to trust any cloud service, like one of my clients For quite a bit of their data, it is covered by some federal regulation, so they're not allowed to put it in any cloud service, so they have to spin up their own servers for any use of that data. And so that would be a case where you'd want to run your own. Normally, it'd be far too much bother to run your own. But if you can't trust the cloud, that's what you have to do. LDAP is what Microsoft uses in Active Directory. This is just a protocol to send directory information over a network. It can be done over plain text, but it also does have encrypted versions. And Kerberos is a way just to avoid sending passwords over the network. It's a fairly complicated system where it uses symmetric encryption and mutual authentication, and it issues you a ticket, which gives you 10 hours to connect to a cloud service, and then you need another ticket. You send up something like a name and password, and it gives you a temporary ticket to use. So here's some of the components you'll see. The principal is the client trying to connect. The realm is the Kerberos network, and it gives you a ticket that authenticates your identity. And they're called credentials, a ticket, and a service key, which I think specifies what service that ticket will work on. You have a key distribution center, a ticket granting service, and a ticket granting ticket. And at the heart of it all, there is a thing called the golden ticket, which is the master key to the whole system. And the hacking tool Mimikatz can frequently steal the golden ticket. And if you steal the golden ticket from a Microsoft Windows domain, you have to rebuild the domain controller from scratch. It's an enormous amount of work. So anyway, that's Kerberos, used by Microsoft Windows, developed at MIT. So here's principal contacts the key distribution center requesting authentication. It then sends you, after you send a name and password or something to prove you're okay, it will then send you a session key and a ticket granting ticket. Alice decrypts the session key and uses it to request permission from the ticket granting service. And the ticket granting service verifies the key and gives her a second key, a session key, which now she can access the printer. And to get a service ticket encrypted with the printer's key, now she can connect to the printer and has a period of time, typically 10 hours, where she is allowed to use that printer. So that's how it works. Sounds ridiculously complicated, but that's what's really being used by Windows domain systems. Here's all these different servers are here. There are various weaknesses of this, but anyway, it's still in common use, and they keep upgrading it to solve problems. So one thing about it is you have to have all your systems have to have synchronized clocks since it goes by time. So you have to have something like network time service running to make sure all these different systems have their clocks synchronized within 5 minutes of each other, or users will not be able to use the tickets they get. And so here's some of the weaknesses. The key distribution center has stored all the keys, so if that gets compromised, they can steal them all. Key distribution center and the ticket granting service are single points of failure. If they're down, the system stops working. You can replay attacks for some period of time, I guess typically 10 hours. There was a version where you could guess a session key for another user, and that's been closed. And the keys are also stored in plain text in the client's RAM, so that's another place you might be able to steal them. Anyway, Sesame is another authentication system that adds some features not present in Kerberos, the most important being public key encryption. So it doesn't have plain text storage of symmetric keys, so it's considered an upgrade. I've never seen anybody use it, but it is there. And then Radius is the really old way for remote users to come in. So old, right in the name, it has dial-in users. This dates from the time of the 56K modem and the hard-coded analog copper line you'd dial in on. So it would come in and you'd pass it a name and password, and it would authenticate your users and let them have remote connection to the system. That used UDP. Diameter was the system to improve Radius that used TCP and had some advancements. Right, TakeAxe was Cisco's attempt to compete with this. So TakeAxe was the original one, and TakeAxe Plus is newer. That gives two-factor authentication and encrypts everything, not backwards compatible. They all do the same thing. They have some way to store credentials so remote users can authenticate and connect over the network. PAP was the original system where you would actually send your password in plain text over the wire, which is, of course, a terrible idea. Anybody that can sniff the network traffic can just steal the password. So the step up was challenge, handshake authentication protocol, CHAP. So the server would send you a challenge. You'd add that challenge to your password and hash it, and then send that over the wire. So the thing you send over the wire proves that you know the password, but it's not trivial to extract the password from it. And Microsoft Active Directory domains use Kerberos, and the domains can have various trust relationships where one domain is trusted by another, and this is what you typically do with partner companies or when you acquire companies. It's one of the main reasons people need Windows servers. If you are a huge company like Best Buy and you get, say, bought out by somebody else like Microsoft, then you have your 100,000 computers scattered all over the world that have to be integrated into Microsoft's 10 million computers scattered all over the world. And Microsoft Active Directory domain controllers have the ability to handle that massively complicated task of saying the administrators here should get this much privilege over there, these administrators should get this privilege over there, this sales desk should go here. You know, you can really integrate two companies together at that scale. And if you were using Unix, it has nothing that can remotely handle that problem for you. You absolutely need Microsoft Windows servers to handle that complicated business problem. All right, so the access control models go like there's three models: discretionary, mandatory, and non-discretionary. Those are the general types of access models which determine, after you've decided you believe who somebody is because they've sent you authentication, then the question is, how do I control what they do? Discretionary access control is what you have on your home computer. You own the computer. You can take any file on that computer and share it with others at your discretion. It is up to you. You own it. There's a person who owns it, and the owner can make decisions about who's allowed to use it. Mandatory access control is for a military situation. The subjects have clearance, objects have labels, things like confidential, secret, and top secret, and there's got to be a governing authority where you have to submit claims to prove your level of security and upgrade your security and so on. So there's an authority, and they control what you're allowed to see and what you're not allowed to see. Non-discretionary access control is where users don't have discretion. They can't transfer objects to other subjects, and this can either be role-based or task-based. Role-based is what you typically have at a normal company using Microsoft Active Directory. You sort your employees into groups like nurse, backup administrator, help desk, and then because they're in that group, they get certain access to certain files and servers and printers and other devices. And so this is the normal way you do it. Since you have employees that come and go and get promoted and get moved, it's best to just sort them into categories and give the category access to something rather than trying to assign permissions to individual users. That's role-based. And then there's task-based, which is very similar, based on the task you're performing. Another way to look at it, rather than saying someone is a certain role, like a medical technician, you might instead say they have these three tasks they do. It's just a question of how you organize your business. And then there's rule-based access control, where you just have a series of rules, like firewall rules, and this applies largely when you say what time of day they can log in, something like that, where it's commonly, so people often, even if they're in a role, they have a further restriction. Your account will only work from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, because that's normal working hours are in there, and we don't expect anybody to be coming in at funny times at that role. And if they do, we're going to deny them access because they're probably a criminal who stole somebody's computer or credentials trying to sneak in. All right, and then you can have other rules like content dependence, where it has other criteria, like you can only see your own HR data but nobody else's, limitations of when you get in. Even if you're in the HR department, certain things might be blocked to you by other rules. And context dependent, like I mentioned, the time of day may be used, that only certain people are expected to come in at night, and if you're not one of them, your credentials won't work at night. All right, let's try another Kahoot. That's this one. OU, yes, OU is organizational unit. Yep, that's a big part of the Microsoft access control. You group things into organizational units, and then you say which groups of users are allowed to access the stuff in that organizational unit. Yeah. It gets very complicated. There are about 7 tests of levels of understanding controlling Active Directory servers. And if you pass those tests, you can get a pretty good job administering Windows domains. It's quite complicated, and those people are in great demand. At least they were a few years ago. And I don't think anything's changed, except now they probably want to do it all on Azure. Hacker Kitty has got a good logo. All right. All right. So what does AAA stand for? Accounting, yep. Authentication, authorization, and accounting. It keeps track of what people do, so you can then review it. If somebody does a bad thing, you can look at your accounting log to see which user logged in and did that bad thing. All right, which one gives you SSO at internet scale? SAML is typically used at internet scale. LDAP and Kerberos are used by Active Directory within an organization. And Identity as a Service is a general container. This is probably a fair CISSP question. You could argue that this is a true answer in that that provides identification at internet scale, although maybe not single sign-on, but the most direct answer is SAML. And this is the kind of thing you'll see very often in CISSP questions. It's not 100% true that one is completely right and the others are all completely wrong. More than one answer has some truth, and you still have to choose the best. That's why you really have to go through practice tests to prepare for the CISSP exam. Simply knowing what's in the book is not enough. You also have to understand the strange way they write their questions. All right, and what service does Log On with Google provide? Yeah, I think federated identity management is the best answer. It gives you an identity which is determined by some other system which you can trust. Once again, you could make some argument for the others, but this is the most direct answer to the question. And again, you don't know if it's single sign-on. You might only get access to one system by doing this. That would be a decision you make separately. Do you let this one login be considered sufficient to let them reach multiple systems or not? That's a different issue than what's described here. All right, in Kerberos, which component is the workstation logging in? That's the principal. You are the principal trying to log in, and these other systems are used to determine whether they decide to let you in or not. All right, and what access control model is used on a home Windows laptop? Discretionary access control. Somebody is the owner of the laptop, and they are the owner of all the files on the laptop, and they can give them to anybody they want to. All right. stop the recording.